I don't know if we've got a bell ringer today or not to start our class, but a couple of announcements first. We need to remember Terry. He called me yesterday and he's sore, not feeling very up to speed. So this morning I'll be preaching, and tonight David Howard is scheduled to preach. I don't know if he will even feel like being here or not, but if he's not here, he's really feeling on the downside. And yesterday when I talked to him, can't remember when, 11, 12, 1 o'clock, something like that, I could hear it in his voice that he was hurting. So let's make sure we keep him and also Janice in our prayers. Also, I apologize to Glenda this morning already because I failed to mention Wednesday night. She had told me that Gary, her son, had tested positive, had very light symptoms, was out cutting grass, but having to stay away from people. So she's that whole family is not going to be able to come and have Thanksgiving with Glenda. So that's not good. We need to remember all the others, and also our two grandkids that come with us, April and Colin. Their other grandmother has been in, out, and back in the hospital, and they have finally figured out that she probably has a very severe UTI, but last night they also said it was possible that she also had it was so severe that she had bladder and kidney infection go along with it. So she hadn't been able to keep food down or running fevers and all. So she's a sick puppy right now. So if you would, keep them in your prayers. And yes, ma'am. Okay. If you didn't hear that, Miranda's dad is going to Kirkland for an oxygen study tomorrow to get him qualified for in-home oxygen use and all. So let's keep her and them in our prayers. Anyone else? Yes, ma'am. Okay. Sister Patricia's mother is having back surgery December the 9th. So that's all there is. Brother Jim, would you lead us in a prayer before we begin class?
Heavenly Father, we're so thankful for this day and for the blessings that we enjoy. We pray for those that have been mentioned that are sick or recovering from surgery. We pray that you would give them a speedy recovery back to their normal portion of health. Heavenly Father, be with us this morning as we study. We pray that those things that we say and that we do will be beneficial, that we might grow stronger in your word. We pray that you would be with the teacher this morning, give him a recall of those things he is preparing, and help us to listen with our minds, and put these things into our daily lives. This prayer we pray in Christ's name.
Amen. Wednesday night, we had started a study of David and Bathsheba, and we got probably close to halfway through instead of all the way through. So today we're going to pick up where we left off and finish off the study of David and Bathsheba. So if you would, get your Bibles and turn to 2 Samuel chapter 11. 2 Samuel chapter 11. And we're going to begin in verse 22. Actually, we're not going to start in 11:22. We're going to start in chapter 6, verse 22. Chapter 6, verse 22. Because Wednesday night, when we was talking about David, what we had mentioned was that, in previous classes also, that how when he was first chosen, when he had defeated Goliath and all how devout he was and what a good person he was along the way. Well, when we get to chapter 6, And that's not verse 20. Well, hang on a second. Let me get to the right page. Chapter 6 and verse 22 said, this is David talking, and just to remind you, this is when they had moved the ark, and now he was coming in dancing and rejoicing. And verse 21 will give us some context. David said unto Michal, it was before the Lord which chose me before thy father and before all his house to appoint me ruler over the people of the Lord, over Israel. Therefore will I play before the Lord. So if you remember this, Michal had tried to chastise him for all of the dancing and carrying on he was doing. And to me, at least in verse 21, it starts showing that David has somewhat of an ego that is starting to take place here, and a change in his overall attitude. Because now, instead of being humble, he tells Michal, God chose me to lead the people even before your father Saul. Now, what had David previously said about Saul that in my mind validates what I said about his change of attitude? If you recall, when Saul offered him a wife, David said, who am I that I should, well, in essence, be associated with the royal family? So there he was very humble. And now he's telling her, God chose me above your own dad. So that to me gives an indication that he has a change of attitude, change of heart, and we've all seen and know it. Sometimes people, power goes to their head and they do things that they normally wouldn't do. And then verse 22 points out, and I will yet be more vile than thus, and will be base in mine own sight. And of the maidservants which thou hast spoken of them shall I be had in honor. So again, now he's gathering the handmaids in and just telling her that, hey, I don't care what you think, I'm going to do this. And then verse 23, therefore Michal, the daughter of Saul, had no child unto the day of her death. So she is the only wife that we know of David that had no child. David had children by many wives and concubines, but this wife had no child with David. Now we're going to pick up in chapter 22 of chapter 11, verse 22 of chapter 11. Sorry? Well, all things have God's approval, but I understand what you're saying, and I sort of think it may have been her rejecting him, God allowing her to reject him, but if she didn't like what he had done dancing, and now he says, you're over here, I'm going to do this, you can see where she was more or less in control at that point, saying, look, that's the way you're going to be. I'm not going to have anything to do with you. Had to factor into the lineage. Well, both lines of the lineage comes through Bathsheba. So, and I think my personal opinion is because of everything that she wound up being David's favorite anyway. So, yeah, right. And yeah, it wasn't like a half and half. Everything comes through the same set of parents when it comes to David. Absolutely. Anything else? Okay, starting with verse 22 of chapter 11. If you recall, Uriah had been killed. Joab was sending the messenger back to talk to David. Wanted to keep the messenger out of trouble by telling him that if David gets upset, remind him of these factors and all. So we're going to start right there with verse 22. So the messenger went and came and showed David all that Joab had sent him for. And the messenger said unto David, surely the men prevailed against us and came out unto us into the field, and we were upon them even unto the entering of the gate. And the shooters shot from off the wall unto thy servants, and some of the king's servants be dead, and thy servant Uriah the Hittite is dead also. Now, why do you think, first off, Joab armed this messenger with all this information? Because to me, there's a little backstory there. What did they have a habit of doing to messengers back in those days if they didn't like the message? Kill them. So Joab was trying to protect this messenger by giving him some reasoning why David should not bother him. Now, verse 25 says, David then said unto the messenger, thus thou shalt say unto Joab, let not this thing displease thee, for the sword devoureth one as well as another. Make thy battle more strong against the city, and overthrow it, and encourage thou him. If you think about it, this particular verse, again, tells you a whole lot about what's going on in David's mind. How many commanders, how many leaders of armies are going to take that kind of news that easily without blaming somebody for not paying attention to what they was doing? David knew that he established the situation that caused that. But yet he is still trying to go with the cover-up scheme. Well, people are going to die in battle. Don't worry about it. Just go get stronger. Be more aggressive. Do your thing. Capture that city for me. So, with him being the cause of this, again, like I say, the cover-up sometimes is as bad or worse than the crime. It was all on David's shoulders that he put the people into the position that killed Uriah. But here's the other thing. David was out to get Uriah, get him out of the way, cover up the fact that he had had an illicit affair with Uriah's wife. Sometimes there's a term that we use in the military that's called collateral damage. You ever heard that term? And what does it mean? Sometimes it's unintended damages, but also sometimes it's the point where you know other things are going to happen. This is your main target and focus. You know others may be in danger, but that's irrelevant because I'm going after this target. And look what the messenger told David. They prevailed against us. There were shooters. Some of the king's servants be dead, and also Uriah. So David was not only at this point a murderer of Uriah, but because he had put that plan into place, even though he didn't actually commit the crime himself, he set it up. He was the one that caused it all. And look how many others were killed because of his intent to get one person. So instead of just being a murderer, he is a multiple murderer at this point. Questions, comments? Then verse 26. And when the wife of Uriah heard that Uriah, her husband, was dead, she mourned for her husband. If you recall, Wednesday night we was talking about Well, we didn't exactly get into it this way, but I will today. Do you think that Bathsheba had a clue what David was up to? Or was David organizing this even behind her back? Don't think she knew. I don't either, because as we covered Wednesday night, I think sometimes that she gets the blame for some stuff that she shouldn't, and it was David and David's position that allowed all this to happen, and now she's going to go into mourning. Now, what period of time do you think she mourned for David before Uriah before she went and married David? Because if you look at the next verse, 27 says, "And when the mourning was past, David sent and fetched her to his house, and she became his wife and bare him a son. But the thing that David had done displeased the Lord." So if we stop a little bit short on that one, David sent and fetched her to his house, and she became his wife after the mourning period. How long did she mourn? Mm-hmm. Okay. In the Jewish tradition, there are multiple periods of mourning. There's one called Aninum, which is the period of mourning between death and burial. And then there is the period Shiva, which is 7 days from the burial, 7 days from burial. And then there's another one, Shiloashim, which is mourning for an entire month. And then there's another one for a year. But in my estimation, or my opinion, it sort of goes back to the same thing as Abigail. Abigail, in essence, set up her husband, who? Who was Abigail's husband? Nabal. And she knew he was going to die, but he died at God's hand, so she mourned, and she would have mourned the minimum required amount of time, which would have been the 7 days, as goes back to Genesis. Then Bathsheba, again, in my estimation, she did the same thing and mourned the required period of the 7 days, and then married David. And is there a reason why I think, I know there's a reason, but what reason would you suppose that I think that it was only a 7-day mourning period? He is still in the cover-up mode. So as soon as she had met, in essence, the bare minimum requirement that was allowed for grieving, he marries her, so now he can continue that cover-up. Questions, comments then through chapter 11? Yes, ma'am. No, because it all, to me, at least, boils down to the fact of why. Eisenhower had predicted, or on their plotting boards, had estimated that there was going to be a 25% casualty rate. That is a huge casualty rate for a military operation. But what was the option? More people would die if you didn't do your duty. We can also look at the dropping of the bomb of Hiroshima. over 100,000 died. Many, many not military, civilians. But the person that dropped the bomb, in essence, said if I didn't do that, more millions would have died, because if they had to go into a land invasion of Japan, there were going to be astronomical numbers of people dead. So a military leader setting up for a engagement, if they're doing it for the right reason and right motive that it has to be done, and take all the precautions they can, people are going to die. So, yes, sir, David. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And if there's options, you never attack the strongest point. But David absolutely set him up so Uriah was going to get killed, put him at the hottest spot of the battle, started it, and then retreated from him and left him and a few others out there to die. So that sort of answer your question? Yep. Absolutely. If that's all with chapter 11, we'll go to chapter 12 now. Then remember the last part, though, of verse 27. What David did had displeased the Lord. And if you recall earlier on, David was chosen because he was a man after God's own heart. But now what he had changed and did displeased God. So starting with verse 12, the Lord sent Nathan unto David, and he came unto him and said unto him, there were two men in one city, the one rich, the other poor. The man had exceeding many flocks and herds, but the poor man had nothing, save one little ewe lamb, which he had bought and nourished up, and it grew up together with him and with his children. It did eat of his own meat and drank of his own cup, and lay in his bosom, and was unto him as a daughter. I imagine there's a lot of pet lovers in here. I think ever since Andrew and I have been married, there's only been a very short periods of time that there hadn't been a cat in the house. We know that that cat is just an animal. However, I wish I had a picture to show you, because the one we've got now that we got from Elmore Rescue, the pound over there, it's a great big old, what's it called? Orange tabby or what? In other words, it looks like Morris. Very stocky, very healthy. And when he stretches out, he takes about a yard to stretch out. It's about 3 feet long. And the other night, Andrew was sitting reclined, semi-reclined in a recliner, had the footrest up. And the cat was laying on her lap between her legs with his feet down at her feet and up just like that on his back, just enjoying so much the attention. So we treat animals as though they're people a lot of times. So that's what that meant here, that this man, it was unto him as a daughter. It was a pet, but that's how close it was to him. So verse 4 then says, and the traveler came unto the rich man, and he spared to take of his own flock and of his own herd to dress for the wayfaring man that was come unto him, but took the poor man's lamb and dressed it for the man that was come to him. I don't know if you've really thought about this part this way or not, but Nathan here was sent by God to talk to David about his action, what he had done. And the story that he sets him up with says that the man in the field, the rich man, had multiple flocks and herds. How many big ranchers do you know that can go out and they even name their animals? Most of them just put a tag in their ear and put a number on them. They don't care about them at all. They're there to make money for profit. Sure, they don't want to see one die because that's money out of their pocket, but most of them don't have any real attachment to the animal as far as the animal goes. But here, and Nathan is telling David, this rich man had all these animals out there to make money on, didn't care about. And here, this one poor individual had this one little ewe lamb that they cared about as if it were family. You see what Nathan is doing to Daniel here? Just pour it. Yes, sir. Yeah. Absolutely. Good point that the traveler came to the rich man, and in Jewish tradition, if a traveler comes to your place, you're the one that's supposed to take care of him. And then by the rich man getting that lamb, he was probably a situation that he was a hired servant or in our terms today, maybe a sharecropper or something where the landowner had some control so he could take it. And then David was angry. His anger was greatly kindled against the man, and he said unto Nathan, as the Lord liveth, the man that hath done this thing shall surely die. Why do you think David's anger was kindled against that situation? Because I think this tells you something else about David. He still had a heart. He still had a conscience. He saw the injustice and he wanted to remedy the injustice. But how many times, and David, you're in a prime position to answer this question, how many times do people point to someone else but fail to recognize their own problems? When I was in the Air Force, I can't tell you how many times I had to bring people in for counseling, and this is where you come in. And they would immediately go to it being personal. I was trying to address the issue, but to them, didn't like them and I was fussing at them. When it was all their own, I was only doing it because they earned it, but they couldn't see it that way. Here, David couldn't see what he had done to this point was the same as this situation. Verse 7, and Nathan said to David, thou art the man. If you had been in the room with Nathan and David when this conversation took place, and you had been looking specifically at David, what do you think his countenance would have been like? The change in his appearance? How many times do you tell somebody something, some shocking news, and what does their facial expression give away? Jaw drop, all manner of things. So I think it would have been very interesting if we could have seen David's physical reaction to this, but it definitely got his attention. Shows how what? How, how brave Nathan was to confront David. Yeah, that's true. But Nathan was directly sent by God, so that should have bolstered his courage just a little bit. Let's not get that far off track today. Verse 8. Oh, well, let's finish with verse 7. When Nathan said to David, "Thou art the man. Thus saith the Lord God of Israel, I anointed thee king over Israel, and I delivered thee out of the hand of Saul. And I gave thee thy master's house and thy master's wives into thy bosom, and gave thee the houses of Israel and Judah. And if that had been too little, I would moreover have given unto thee such and such things. Wherefore hast thou despised the commandment of the Lord to do evil in his sight? Thou hast killed Uriah the Hittite with the sword, and hast taken his wife to be thy wife, and hast slain him with the sword of the children of Ammon. Now therefore the sword shall never depart from thine house, because thou hast despised me, and hast taken the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be thy wife. Thus saith the Lord, Behold, I will raise up evil against thee out of thine own house, and I will take thy wives before thine eyes, and give them unto thy neighbor, and he shall be with thy wives in the sight of this sun. For thou didst it secretly, but I will do this thing before all Israel and before the sun. And David said unto Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. And Nathan said unto David, the Lord also hath put away thy sin. Thou shalt not die. I want to pause there for just a minute. Once Nathan comes in and talks to David and tells the story, and David recognizes what he did, he recognized that he sinned and he was going to make amends for it. But what had David said just prior to having knowledge that he was the man, he was the guilty party? I'm sorry? He had pronounced a sentence on the person that would do such thing, and then finds out that he's the one that did it. But Nathan tells him, you're not going to die. However, what else did Nathan tell him? The sword is not going to leave thy house. There's going to be trouble in your household because of, all this. We're not going to have time to go into all of it, but let's just look at a few things. What did David's daughter Tamar, what happened to her? She, in essence, was raped, but who raped her? Stepbrother. So, in that kind of, David takes another man's wife, but now his own son rapes his own daughter. David mentioned to me Wednesday night, because we didn't get through as far as we should have, but how many of David's sons died by the sword? You know, because you told me. How many? 4 of his sons died by the sword. Is not this a fulfillment of what the Lord's punishment was going to be on him? The sword's not going to leave your house. There's going to be trouble in your house. True. I skipped that verse, didn't I? Let's go back. Verse 6. And he shall restore the lamb fourfold. This is after he said he should die. Restore the lamb fourfold, because he did this and because he had no pity. Thank you for pointing that out. I'd skipped that verse, but he said it should be repaid fourfold, and 4 of David's sons died by the sword. So good points. Good points. Questions, comments so far? Okay. This also, to me, at least points out that if David could kill a man, have a man killed, and others die because of it, and commit adultery, that if he can be forgiven by God, there's no sin that man can do that he can't be forgiven of if he truly repents. And here David apparently truly repented. But then it says in verse 14, howbeit, because by this deed thou hast given great occasion to the enemies of the Lord to blaspheme, the child also that is born unto thee shall surely die. Steep price to pay. Verse 15, and Nathan departed unto his house, and the Lord struck the child that Uriah's wife bare unto David, and it was very sick. And David therefore besought God for the child, and David fasted and went in and lay all night upon the earth. And the elders of his house arose and went to him to raise him up from the earth, but he would not, neither did he eat bread with them. And it came to pass on the 7th day that the child died. And the servants of David feared to tell him that the child was dead, for they said, behold, while the child was yet alive, we spake unto him, and he would not hearken unto our voice. How will he then vex himself if we tell him that the child is dead? But when David saw that his servants whispered, David perceived that the child was dead. Therefore David said unto his servants, is the child dead? And they said, he is dead. Then David arose from the earth and washed and anointed himself and changed his apparel and came into the house of the Lord and worshiped. Then he came to his own house, and when he required, they set bread before him, and he did eat. What's the difference? Why, at the point of the child's death, did David go from the mourning, mourning, mourning for the child and being grieved versus after the child's death? You thought that's an excellent point, that David thought that if he kept praying and doing what he could, that the Lord would change his mind and not kill the child. But that didn't happen. And then when the child died, there's nothing else David can do at that point. But do you think that David also recognized that the child was going to a better place, going to heaven, going to be with God? It says that, because David is not, the child can't come back to David, but David can go to the child. And I think that's a lesson for us today when we are grieved when one of our loved ones passes away. That if they have lived a good, faithful life, is it going to hurt? Absolutely. Are we going to grieve? Absolutely. But also in our mind, we need to think that that's not the end for that person. That's just the beginning. They're going to a whole better place. Takes the sting away. Now we'll get down to, we're going to skip down to verse 24 because I'm running short on my time here. And David comforted Bathsheba, his wife, and went in unto her and lay with her, and she bare a son, and she called his name Solomon, and the Lord loved him. She bare a son, called his name Solomon, and the Lord loved him. Now, Wednesday night we went in and showed the genealogy in Matthew and Luke, how both Joseph's lineage and Mary's lineage went back through David and Bathsheba. But I also want you to turn over now to Proverbs 31 and verse 2. Proverbs 31. Wednesday night we had looked at verse 1 that was talking about the king Lemuel and how rabbis and most biblical authorities say that Lemuel was a symbolic name for Solomon. So if that be true, then, and we know Solomon put a lot of Proverbs together, so this could be in reference to him. And if that be true, then the one that's talking, his mother, would be Bathsheba. But look, and the reason I point that out is look specifically at verse 2. What, my son, and what, the son of my womb, and what, the son of my vows? And I underlined son of my vows. What does that mean historically regarding people during that time frame? I'm sorry? Thank you. He was a legitimate child born in wedlock, but also the mother had prayed for and wanted, because if you look back at Samuel, for instance, how did Samuel come about? So they made a vow. I ran out of time. I'm sorry. So I think y'all get what I'm trying to say. Thank y'all for your attention and comments.